Okay, we are on page 77. If you would check there at the bottom of the page, it says shams and delusions. I don't know that we answered it. Did we read this yesterday? We must have read it the other class. Ethan, would you read? We're looking at question number 10, which is what does he mean by reality? I think this is interesting.
Where do you want me to start?
Shams and delusions at the bottom of page 77. Yeah, very bottom.
Okay. One second. Okay. Shams and delusions are esteemed for soundest truths, while reality is fabulous. If men would steadily observe realities only and not allow themselves to be deluded, life, to compare it with such things as we know, would be like a fairy tale and the Arabian Nights entertainment. If we respected only what is inevitable and has a right to be, music and poetry would resound along the streets. When we are unhurried and wise, we perceive that only great and worthy things have permanent and absolute existence, that petty fears and petty pleasures are but the shadow of reality.
I think underlining that would be worthwhile. He's making a case for why we teach humanities, which I used to hear the argument, especially when I was at Page. The argument was, well, I want to be an engineer, I want to be a doctor, I want to do something, STEM related, or I want to do something medical or education. Law. I want to own a business. And none of those things have anything to do with Homer or Dante. And so why do I read those things? And I think being at a classical school, how would you answer that? And you may be one of those people that you have to take humanities, but who becomes an English major anymore? It's one of those subjects. You'll hear a lot of people downplay that. Go to college, be an English major. That's kind of a waste of time. Be a religion major like I was. That's even more of a waste of time. This is the argument. Be a history major. Why would anybody go to school, waste 4 years, when you come out, you got a history degree? How's that going to help you make any money? How would you make an argument being a good classical student as you are? What would be the argument in favor of all those things? Religion, history, literature, which is the humanities. What's the argument for it? So you're juniors now. You've been going through this for 12, some of you 12 years, 13 years if you were in TK. Do you understand the role of humanities in a classical education? I don't know if you noticed it mentioned that Alexander the Great was a pretty successful person. He took Homer with him when he went out on his adventures. He had a copy of Homer. What's a guy like that reading Homer for? It's not going to make you successful. Well, let's just reread what he just said. Maybe this applies. He says, if we respected only what is inevitable and has a right to be, music and poetry would resound among the streets. If we respected only what is inevitable and has a right to be, he seems like he's putting those things at the top of the list. How can you make any money off music and poetry? But if those things were respected, then those things would be resounding along the streets. When we are unhurried and wise, we perceive that only great and worthy things have any permanent absolute existence. Is there a scriptural corollary to that? And you may not be able to quote books, chapter, and verse, but doesn't that sound like what we believe? If we perceive that only great and worthy things have any permanent absolute existence, we would, if we were wise, we would understand that. What does Jesus always tell us? Put righteousness, his righteousness first, and all these things will be added unto you. He's always making that claim, that there's some things that are like your soul lasts forever. why not spend a little time with your soul and feeding your soul with things as opposed to focusing on the body, which isn't going to last forever? And I don't, again, I don't want to be, I don't know how anybody would react to this, but I had the privilege of being in the room when my mother-in-law died. I just missed my father's and my mother's. I was not able to do that. And it was astounding to witness the fact that when you die, you don't even take your body with you. It was still there. She was clearly not in the room. There was no doubt about it. It's not that she had ceased to exist. She was not in the room. Whatever was really, really important about my wife's mother was no longer in that room. And so her body was in the room. And it was still here. And it's like, man, we talk about you can't take your wealth with you, you can't take your property with you. You can't even take your body with you. And yet I knew she still existed. I knew she was a believer, is a believer. So when you see something like that, it changes your perspective when you realize, well, why am I spending so much time, ultimately that day's coming, trying to make this look better, or what comes along with it, and neglect the things of the soul which will live literally forever. That's the argument he's making. When we are unhurried and wise, and unhurried, I mean, none of us are unhurried. That's part of the problem, isn't it? We perceive that only great and worthy things have any permanent and absolute existence. To me, that's very scriptural. I think you could make the case, even though he never says it, so you may argue that he's not a believer, he certainly is in line with Scripture, with what he says. And he talks about why do we spend time with petty fears and petty pleasures, but are the shadow of reality. So that's the answer really to the question. What does he mean when he talks about reality? I think he's talking about those things that last forever. He doesn't use the word soul, but he says great and worthy things, permanent and absolute existence. We ought to spend time with those things which are permanent and absolute existence. And he's arguing the best way to, at least equal to, if not the best way to approach those things is through things like you mentioned earlier, music and poetry, and I would argue even history and things like that, what we call the humanities. And we've always argued here at Caldwell that if you're a good humanities student, you will become a good person. We know there's something more important even than humanities, and that's Scripture. And who would not want to hire a good person? Honestly, none of you are going to leave. Maybe if you go to NC State and you leave with a degree in some engineering or something, you'll have an internship somewhere, and you can go to work immediately. Most people don't do that. Most people have to start over at their job. Like they got an education. Now they got to teach you how to do this job. So what did you learn in college? Well, you learned how to learn. You learned how to be disciplined. You speak well. You write well. You think well. Who wouldn't want that person as opposed to a person that has a degree in something but doesn't think well, speak well, write well? And so that's an argument for the classical education. We think that you're going to be hireable because you have a good mind. You can pick it up real easy. You don't need to learn the skills of that particular job in college. That's not the point of college. It's to make you a better learner and a better person, with classical education would say that, so that anybody would want to hire you and train you how to do this particular job. That makes sense. No one ever told me that. No one ever made that clear. So you also had the advantage of seeing really the purpose of education. Let's read a little more. He says something a little bit later, which I think is worthwhile. Ethan, do you mind?
Is it at the start of this?
This is always, yeah.
This is always exhilarating and sublime. By closing the eyes and slumbering and consenting to be deceived by shows, men establish and confirm their daily life of routine and habit everywhere, which still is built on purely illusory foundations. Children who flow life discern its true law and relations more clearly than men, who fail to live it worthily, but who think that they are wiser by experience, that is, by failure. I have read in a Hindu book that there was a king's son who was being expelled in infancy from his native city, was brought up by a forester, and growing up to maturity in that state, imagined himself to belong to the barbarous race with which he lived. One of his father's ministers, having discovered him, revealed to him that he was, and the misconception of his character was removed, and he knew himself to be a prince. Continues the Hindu philosopher. From the circumstances in which it is placed, mistakes its own character, until the truth is revealed to it by some holy teacher, and then it knows itself to be the behind.
Does that make any sense to you? Anything about that? If you ever, my first class at college was Philosophy 101, and I didn't understand a word. You know, I think I've mentioned that before. There were about 2 or 3 things that I learned from that class, but it was complete over my head. I did not think like a philosopher. Well, that's written like a philosopher, and it makes you go places you don't normally go. But to me, it's sort of equal to the idea that you go through a moment where you're saved, and when you're saved, you finally see life as it really is. You finally realize you're a son or daughter of the King. You finally realize that you've been living an illusion up to that point, in a way. Anyway, there's some similarities between. He's talking about Hinduism and being a Brahmin. That's not the same thing as being saved, but there are some similarities. You want to keep reading?
I perceive that we inhabitants of New England live this mean life, but we do because our vision does not portray the surface of things.
See, we don't look past the surface, and that's what they're going to reward you on this test in the spring. If you can look past the surface and find out the real meaning of that poem, and I'm trying to give you the tools to do that, you will be rewarded. But most people just live on the surface. You know, they go from class to class, life to life, and everything's on the surface, what you feel, what you see, what you hear. And this whole book is designed to get you to go past the surface, to dig deeper. And I'm not going to make you, well, maybe I will. It's good stuff here.
We think that is which appears to be. If a man should walk through this town and see only the reality, where, think you, would the Nilum go to? If he should give us an account of the realities he beheld there, we should not recognize the place in his description. Look at a meeting house, or a courthouse, or a jail, or a shop, or a dwelling house, and say that what that thing really is before a true gaze. And they would go all to pieces in your account of them. Men esteem truth remote, and the outskirts of the system, behind the farthest star, before Adam and after the last man. In eternity there is indeed something true and sublime. But all these times and places are occasions are now and here. God himself culminates the present moment, and will never be more divine in the lapse of all the ages. And we are enabled to apprehend at all what is sublime and noble only by the perpetual instilling and drenching of the reality that surrounds us. The universe constantly and obediently answers to our conceptions. Whether we travel fast or slow, the track is laid for us. Let us spend our lives in conceiving him. The poet or the artist never yet had so fair and noble a design, but some of his posterity at least could accomplish it.
All right, again, some things that I think would be worth getting out of this, and we're answering question number 10 and 11, we'll get to 11 in just a minute, is that the true reality of things is beyond the surface. And so that's why he loves philosophy, because philosophers go past what you see to what's behind that. And you know, again, that's some similarities with his believers. You know, we're supposed to not live of the flesh, but of the Spirit. And so he's saying life can become really meaningful if you go past the surface, and not just what things appear to be, but what things really are. He talks about the sublime and the noble. Sounds like this. He says, the only way we're able to apprehend what is sublime and noble is by perpetual instilling and drenching of the reality that surrounds us. It sounds like a discipline, doesn't it? It sounds like a daily thing, which is equal to, it's similar to what we know as Christians. We're saved, but it takes a daily walk with Christ in order to become like him and to know him. And he's kind of agreeing with that process, that to really see reality, it's got a daily discipline. So that's what reality is. It's beyond the surface. It's underneath the surface. It's the things that last forever, not the things that are temporary. And Todd, would you read the next? I'm not going to ask you to read much. In fact, we're almost done here. But if you'll read the next sentence and then the last paragraph, I think we'll be finished with this. I have an exercise for you.
Let us spend one day as deliberately as nature, and not be thrown off the track by every nutshell and mosquito's wing falls on play.
And just the next sentence, maybe, go with it.
Let us rise early and fast, or break fast, gently and without perturbation. Let company come and let company go. Let the bells ring and the children cry, determined to make a day of it.
Okay. What do you think he means by that, based on what we've read so far? Let us live one day as deliberately as nature. We talked about that yesterday. A jury deliberates, and not be thrown off the track by every nutshell and mosquito's wing that falls on the rails. Julia, what do you think that means?
It's like saying don't get caught up in like the meaningless, like little details of life.
But you see the image. Here's a huge locomotive traveling down, and a little mosquito's wing, the smallest thing he could imagine. Is it possible for that mosquito wing to derail a locomotive in reality? No. And yet he's saying that's what happens to us. We let the smallest things derail us and cause us problems. And how do you avoid that? According to the beginning of the sentence, one of his themes, how do you avoid letting those little things, the unimportant things, derail you? Again, you live life deliberately. How do you do that? What did we say yesterday? How do you live life deliberately? How do you spend a day deliberately? What does a jury do in the room? Kayla, what does a jury do when it goes and they deliberate? They think, they consider the evidence, they look at it, they're thoughtful. So again, that's how he's saying we should live a day, not just be mindless robots going from thing to thing, and then if you lose something, like I did at home this morning, I couldn't find something I needed, and I've got time, I got to get going. It just sort of derails your day, and instead of stopping and thinking and putting it in perspective, that's how we should live, thoughtfully and not, haphazardly and willy-nilly. Remember that word, pell-mell. All right, so Todd, would you finish this for us and read the very last paragraph? It's the next page, the very last paragraph of the...
I just love the stream I go fishing in. I drink at it, but while I drink, I see the sandy bottom and detect how shallow it is. Its thin current slides away, but eternity remains. I would drink deeper, fish in the sky, whose bottom is pebbly with stars I cannot count on. I know not the first letter of the alphabet. I have always been regretting that I was not as wise as the day I was born. The intellect isn't clear. It discerns and rifts its way into the secrets of things. I do not wish to be any more busy with my hands than is necessary.
All right, so I'd recommend you read it again, and I want you to answer the question, number 12. See what you can do with it. Summarize that particular. It's a great example of how Thoreau writes. You know, he's making a point. He uses a lot of analogies, metaphors. What's he getting at? Summarize it. Read it again. See if you can figure out what he's getting at. Okay, somebody want to volunteer before I call in a couple people just to maybe summarize what, it looks like some of you still writing. Give you a couple minutes. All right, Kyle, what about you? How would you summarize what he just said?
Basically, like, I kind of understood it as, like, life is like what you make of it. You can choose to,
Okay, yeah, I think you're on the right track. Where does he say that? Tell me something he says that would support what you just said.
Like he starts off by saying like time with the streaming of fishing and that he has control over like his life and it's like what he makes of it rather than how life like actually is.
Okay, I mean, he would completely agree with that, that we, as an individual, we have a lot of control over our own life, what we want, how we want